just on some of the actions that we're taking throughout the UN-GGCE to try and help you. As I said, our vision is focusing on that strong political support. So it's not just about the technology. I want you to keep that in mind for this week. I think it's fair to say that modern society is dependent on satellites. And my message is then that modern society is dependent on geodesy, but it doesn't even realize it. If you have a look at this survey that was done in 2012 from the Department of Homeland Security, they found that 15 of 18 critical infrastructure and key resource sectors rely on GPS. And that includes telecommunications, emergency services, and financial exchanges. And this has really got to do out of the P, N, and T. This is the timing component. Telecommunications, emergency services, financial exchanges, other critical infrastructure systems are reliant on precise timing information, predominantly coming from GPS satellites. But do they realize what actually is required for GPS satellites to operate? In many cases, they don't. And we'll focus on that this week. Also, economic growth. Over the next decade, the revenue from GNSS, Earth observation, and satellite telecommunications, which is about 80% of the space market revenue, has a growth rate of 9%. So we don't just have a dependency on geodesy, but we have a growing dependency on geodesy. And this is the risk. There's the risk that many space agencies and satellite operators, so not just the member states, but also the people who are operating the satellites, don't realize that they have a dependency on something called the global geodesy supply chain that we'll touch on in a minute. And therefore, all the applications that are derived from this supply chain and from the operations of satellites are at risk. And this is the story we're trying to explain to politicians. So if you look at that far right-hand side, you've got the space segments. That's where your, GNSS satellites are, Earth observation, satellite communications, could be safety of life systems. All those applications don't operate without this supply chain. And the supply chain includes, if you then go to the far left, observatories, ground observatories like very long baseline interferometry. We'll introduce these particular techniques after this, but some of you will know what they are. Satellite laser ranging. There's also DORIS, GNSS, and gravity. You need to observe that wobble of the Earth, as I was telling you. These are the different techniques that measure that wobble, and they're complementary techniques. They all measure a different component, and it's only when they get brought together and that data is collected, you do the analysis, you then combine the information from these ground observatories to create geodetic products like the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, like Earth orientation parameters. Earth orientation parameters is just a fancy word for measuring the wobble of the Earth, how that moves over time. Now, all that information from the products goes to a ground segment, and that ground segment, they're ground-based stations that provide uplink to the satellites. In some cases, those uplinks happen multiple times a day to the satellites to keep them working accurately and reliably. GPS, for example, every 2 to 3 hours, the ground segment updates the satellite ephemeris data, which is guiding the satellites, giving it information about the location of the Earth with up-to-date rapid product development. If those products aren't being provided accurately and reliably, then it puts at risk the accuracy of the space segment and then the user segment, which is all the use cases on the ground, including those critical infrastructure systems that I talked about before. So this is what I touched on. In recognition of the weaknesses in that supply chain, this General Assembly resolution was passed in 2015. Support from 52 member states, as Ambassador Thompson mentioned before. The issue is that within the last 10 years, still not enough has been done to support that supply chain. Not enough has been done to ensure that we've got the ground infrastructure, the people, and the resources that we need to keep this supply chain running effectively. So when I started in this job in October 2023, the first thing that we did was run some listening sessions, and a number of you were involved in those. We had 11 different listening sessions, some in-person consultation sessions, and we talked to over 500 people from 110 different countries. And to cover broadly the 5 major categories of what was identified as weaknesses from what we heard across the supply chain, that was across these 5 areas. And first of all, evidence. There was little to no information that was made available that decision makers could understand as to why geodesy was important in ways that they could understand it. And because they didn't have the evidence, you don't get the resources. Simple. So you need to tell that story through to the decision makers to get the money. The next one was around awareness, and that's not necessarily up the management line, but it's more looking sideways. So the other different science communities, the space agencies, other satellite operators, do they understand how reliant they are on the supply chain for their products and services to be delivered to their users? The answer is not very well. Across the climate science community in particular, they don't understand geodesy. They're totally dependent on the products that are coming from geodetic satellites and geodetic information, but they don't understand where it comes from. Everyone just assumes that this supply chain of ground observatories and the people doing all the analysis and product development are really well funded, and they're really happy, and there's thousands of them around the world. And the reason they think that is because it's never failed. And the reason it's never failed is because the people who do that work are often, they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, and they don't want to let the thing fail. But because they work so hard, it goes unnoticed. And so they're a victim of their own success in many cases. Capacity development is the next one. As many have already talked about this morning, there's a geodesy crisis in some parts of the world. It's not everywhere, but some parts of the world where there's not enough capacity. There's less and less university courses teaching geodesy or specializing in geodesy, and there's not many short courses available either. And the last one is governance. I like to compare geodesy with something like the World Meteorological Organization. So the WMO, they're a specialized agency within the United Nations. Member states contribute funding every year to keep the services running. But we don't have anything like this for geodesy. So each of your countries is paying money to the WMO to make sure that you've got weather and climate information and you've got a basic observing network around the world, and your countries happily pay that contribution. Don't you think that we should also be doing that for geodesy? It seems crazy to me that we don't have something similar. The really interesting thing was Professor Paul Becker, who's the head of BKG, which is the head of the Mapping and Geodesy Agency in Germany. He used to work for the WMO. He used to be a very high-ranking person within the WMO. He then got moved across to geodesy. He's now the head of geodesy in Germany. And do you know why the Center of Excellence exists and why it's based in Germany? It's because of him. He came across from the WMO and he said, where's your equivalent for geodesy? Where's your global network of people who work on this? Member states contribute money. The center probably still wouldn't exist if it wasn't from him coming across from the WMO and say, we're going to spend some of the BKG budget, some of the German government budget on establishing the center because we ultimately need something like this for geodesy. We don't have that central body with policymakers where all your politicians go every year and have a congress talking about where money should be spent to improve data for geodesy. It happens for meteorology. We don't have it for geodesy. So there's a severe weakness in the governance of how geodesy is run. We're very lucky to have a strong science organisation with the International Association of Geodesy. They're those wonderful people I've talked about, the scientists working in universities and organisations that have not let the supply chain fail, but they are not resourced well enough to continue to do this work. And it's a lot of in-kind contribution that is keeping this thing alive. And it's just not strong enough to be reliable for the future. For time, I'm going to jump over this, but I want to pay particular attention to this diagram. These blue dots represent the VLBI network around the world, and the size of the dot represents roughly proportional to how much useful data came from those stations across 2023-24. And the red squares represent the SLR stations. And again, size proportional to how effective those stations were in the development of geodetic products and services. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't look very reliable to me. If you were to design a network of how to measure the wobble of the Earth, is this how you would set it up? Particularly given that these techniques need to be complementary. There's not enough stations, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. Outside of Europe, there's no continent that has 3 VLBI and SLR stations co-located together. If Australia drops off the map, we've demonstrated that the quality of the Earth orientation parameters can drop by up to 20%. So that's dependent on one government to keep things running for a global network. This is not accurate enough, and it's not reliable enough, and that's the critical part. This is the story we're trying to tell. If you were to design a network, you would want, I would say, 3 to 4 VLBI and SLR stations that are co-located with long-term sustainable funding. And that's far from what we have in terms of a ground observatory network to measure the movement of the Earth over time. So this was a story that I presented to, and this is how Dr. Mark Hill puts it. Dr. Mark Hill's from the US Department of Defense, and she says the global geodesy supply chain exhibits an exceedingly fragile stability and could easily collapse due to a number of material and non-material concerns. The material is the ground-based stations, right? The non-material relates to the geodesy crisis that they're predominantly facing within the US government at the moment. They don't have enough people to do this to help operate the GPS system. So this is not something that is being blown out of proportion. This is someone who is responsible for the geodetic products being fed into the GPS system that probably runs your critical infrastructure and you don't even know it within your countries, telling you that it could easily collapse. And she presents 3 examples where it's almost collapsed in the last 5 years, one of which was due to a station where the person running the station was unable to explain to the dean why they should keep that VLBI station running. It was a communications issue. And Dr. Mark Hill flew from the US to this station to talk to the dean, and I don't think the dean's ever been more surprised to have a visitor in all his life. So we're taking so much for granted, and something's got to change. And this is the story we're trying to tell to try and instigate that change. I then also explained this in the presentation I've been most scared of giving in my whole life. Ryan was there. He can probably attest to seeing the sweat coming off my head, was when I presented this. I don't know, maybe you can see it here, this forum. That's the International Committee on GNSS. It's a UN organization where you have all the different industry and satellite operators. So the people who run GPS, Galileo, Beidou, GLONASS, they're all sitting in the room, and I presented information essentially explaining that I don't think the GNSS services are robust. They're not reliable enough given the weaknesses in the supply chain. And I finished that speech and I waited for the tomatoes to be thrown at me. And in part, I hope they did, because it would have meant, oh, we've got all these backup systems. We do this to counter for that argument that you're making. The first question they said to me was, how much would it cost to fix it? So they weren't debating whether we're right or wrong. And by the end of it, to read out the last line, they recognise that strengthening the global geodesy supply chain should be prioritised to ensure GNSS services are more robust. So there was no debate as to whether or not something needs to be done. It's really about the how. And they need to be working with us to make sure that we have a stronger supply chain to ensure that they've got the services that they can provide to their users. A couple of other things I just briefly want to touch on is that we create policy briefs. We're trying to translate this very technical language into language that you can understand and help you talk to your policymakers. So a lot of what I've just covered there is in that hidden risk policy brief that we have. We have a longer report, but there's also a 2-page brief. We've then done some work on the reliance on the global geodesy supply chain for climate science. That was to build awareness in that community. And then thirdly, we've got a policy brief around radio frequency spectrum protection. And this is some work that we've been doing with the International Telecommunications Union on explaining the importance of protecting certain spectrums so that we can observe quasars coming from outer space that we need for VLBI. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session. I mentioned policy and defence engagement. This is us trying to get together with not just the science community, but with people from the defence community and policy community to explain geodesy in ways that they can understand it. And we've run an in-person workshop to try and start that process, which was very successful. The final thing I want to touch on is stronger governance arrangements. And we have already developed a multilateral memorandum of understanding. That is, it's been operational since the 10th of March this year. This is really an opportunity for organisations to sign up to as a participant. It effectively helps you with your awareness raising so that you can go to your government agency or your organisation lead and say, we consider this to be important and we think more needs to be done to protect this supply chain. But it's non-binding and there's no resource commitment. So it is really an awareness raising exercise. The next step that some countries have started to take is the development of more binding agreements, and they might be bilateral or regional agreements. This is where stronger resource commitments are put in place, but hopefully they can help generate stronger revenue sources for you to be doing the work in geodesy, and having those binding agreements help also when you have a change of government. If you have something in place that says we have an agreement with this country that we're going to do this work, sometimes if a new government comes in, that can help you secure those funds from the start. And then thirdly, we're working on an options paper to explain what would a intergovernmental organisation look like for the future, and are member states interested in developing some sort of intergovernmental organisation where there are stronger member state contributions. This is something that we will have an options paper out for member states to consider by the end of this year. We've got a range of newsletters that we work on. We've also putting up all the videos that we produce on our YouTube channel, and including the information that will be coming out of this workshop will be made available there. So we already have all the presentations from the Africa workshop, for example, up on that YouTube channel. And then here are all our friends from Indonesia doing our funny dance moves, a bit like, well, it was a lot of fun, wasn't it, Victor? We had Antonius up dancing, it was good. He's a very good dancer. So we were very grateful to have our friends in Indonesia host a workshop focused on joining land and sea last year. It was really good to bring together people from across not just the science organisations, but also the standards and academia as well, looking at how do you practically deal with some of these issues, not just from a, how do we develop a report or a document, but this was very, very practical. Countries showing how they're currently doing it, and importantly, talking about some of the challenges that they've faced. So this was really good, and I'm pleased to see that we can continue some of that discussion this week as well. And then finally, we're doing capacity development, but I think you all know about that. There's going to be a little workshop we're running in Bangkok this week that you might like to attend. So these are the two, if I can focus it on two key things that we're trying to do in the GGCE. We have a small team, and for that reason, we need to be very focused. I don't want to spread ourselves too thin. See, we're doing lots of different things here, but they broadly come under two main concepts. The first one is evidence. We're trying to give you the evidence to explain the importance of this to your policymakers. And the second one is capacity development. That's running workshops like this. So there's a lot of things we could do as a centre, but with the resources we've got, we're focusing on those two things because we think by doing the evidence and capacity development, that's really going to cause you, allow you to trickle down the effects of those things to cover off on some of the other issues you have around awareness and in particular capacity into the future and bringing on the next generation. So I'll stop there, and we've got one more presentation to get to before lunch that I'll quickly get through. But if there's a quick question, maybe I'll come back to you first. Did you want to ask your question from before, even if it's not strictly relevant to this one?
Question before slide. I really want the background story of agricultural livestock that applications. How do you detect the early disease in cows? So I really want the background history. How do you use these applications for cows? So thank you.
I'll provide you with a bit more information later on, and I'll also get you to have a look at the resources link. There is some really detailed information there about the case study that was run from an agricultural perspective, and it provides the cost benefits analysis as well of what came out of that study. So start by having a look at that resource link, and then if you've got more detailed questions, we can have a discussion.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.